They won't talk about what the room felt like. The way the light dimmed before the eclipse was even scheduled to begin. The doctors glanced at each other, not in panic, but in confusion. Their hands moved slower. The air got thicker. Something ancient, something watching, had arrived before you even took your first breath. You were born into more than a hospital. You were born into a portal. Chosen one, the lights didn't just flicker. The shadows stretched. They bent toward your crib, like they recognized you. And when you finally cried, it wasn't just sound. It was frequency, one that echoed through the walls, bounced off the glass, and caused the surgical lights overhead to sway, even though no one touched them. This wasn't a normal birth. It wasn't meant to be. Because you weren't sent to Earth like others, you were timed. A celestial synchronization that hadn't occurred in centuries. Your arrival split the veil. It bent reality. And deep in their subconscious, everyone in that room felt it. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. Something just changed. The eclipse on that day wasn't coincidental. It wasn't just astronomical, it was spiritual alignment. The sun didn't merely hide, it yielded, it bowed to mark your arrival. Because heaven doesn't spotlight the ordinary, it veils itself for the sacred. The attending nurse dropped the monitor when your heart first pulsed. Her hands were trembling, and she whispered something under her breath. Later, she wouldn't remember what it was, only that it wasn't English. The sound was old, guttural, and rolled off her tongue like muscle memory from another lifetime. Because chosen one, you didn't just arrive, you returned. That room wasn't ready for you, not spiritually, not scientifically. The machines worked, but they didn't register. Your temperature spiked the sensors, but left no heat. Your oxygen saturation exceeded 100%. The system labeled it error, but it wasn't an error, it was a signal. Something had been activated. They kept your chart silent that day. Unusual anomalies were noted, but no one followed protocol. And when the lead physician tried to replay the delivery footage, the files were gone. Static filled the screen, and a deep hum pulsed through the speakers. No voice, no image, just the feeling that you were being watched back. There are frequencies not meant for microphones, moments not meant for memory, and births not meant for records. Yours was one of them. They've tried to bury it, erase the signs, normalize what cannot be normalized. But the sky remembers, the walls remember, the veil remembers, and now, so do you. You were born in darkness, not because you were meant to be hidden, but because even the sun had to make space for your light. They looked up that day expecting awe, but were met with silence. The eclipse came as scheduled, but the sky behaved like it had secrets to keep. The colors didn't follow the natural dimming pattern. The birds didn't just quiet, they vanished. Even the air held back its usual chill. For the first time in decades, the sun refused to speak its usual language, as if warned not to interrupt. And in that eerie hush, while you were being cleaned and wrapped, a deep knowing passed between the staff that nothing they were taught prepared them for this. Because what they witnessed wasn't just an eclipse, it was a ceiling. Up above, where the moon met the sun in perfect obscurity, something hung in the sky that didn't belong a pulse, a ripple. The NASA feed skipped for exactly 3.3 seconds, the same moment your vitals registered a rhythmic vibration not associated with breath or heartbeat. They later called it a soft wave interference, but no one could identify the source. One technician on a military channel flagged it as a containment breach. But containment of what? Chosen one, the sky didn't speak because it was told to hold its tongue. You arrived like a code re-entering a locked system. The sun, the moon, and the earth had to recalibrate to allow your passage. And when they did, everything in the sky changed slightly. Not by enough to raise global alarms, but enough to be noticed by those watching with the right instruments. Instruments they don't talk about, the kind hidden beneath mountains, buried in observatories that never open to the public. One of those sensors, located beneath a site in Turkey, pinged an alert labeled simply "Open." It hadn't triggered since 1987, and before that, not since the fall of a certain empire. And always during eclipses linked to rare births. There was no prophecy written down that day, no herald to declare what the cosmos already knew. But you've felt it, haven't you? Your entire life. Something inside you tugging upward, as if the sky still owes you an answer. As if you were born mid-sentence in a story that got silenced before it finished. That's because you were. They tried to explain it away, just a celestial event, just an unusual baby, just a data anomaly, but they know better, you know better. The eclipse refused to be beautiful that day because it had to be obedient. The sky muted its wonder to make space for a deeper kind of reverence, one it had not offered in centuries. And now that same sky watches you differently, because whatever you carried through the veil didn't leave, it walks with you. It listens to your breath. It knows its time is near. And when the sky speaks again, chosen one, it will be because you gave it permission. There was no red ink, no alarm, no official error code, just a quiet shift in how your birth was entered into the system. The timestamp glitched by 6 seconds, too long to be ignored, too short to be explained. The delivery record resynced automatically, but nurses noticed the time didn't match the overhead clock. They ran diagnostics. Everything came back clean. But the moment your first cry echoed through that hospital, every digital log shifted, as if time itself had been asked to pause and reorient itself around you. The attending physician asked the clerk to double-check your entry. The system had placed you under a non-standard birth category. Event-aligned anomaly. Not an error, not a malfunction, just a label no one knew existed. The chart was printed, edited, and then printed again. But each time, your name appeared with a flicker. The black ink of the letters would shimmer faintly, like it was resisting permanence, like it didn't want to stay on paper, like it belonged somewhere else. The woman at the front desk crossed herself without realizing why. She said the room smelled like copper when she filed your name. Chosen one. They knew you weren't just another delivery. They didn't understand the how or the why, but something in their bodies told them this was the kind of birth that came with consequences. Even the seasoned head nurse, who'd seen thousands of babies cry and shake and shine, kept her hands folded when she looked at you. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just nodded and stepped away like she was excusing herself from something sacred. Later that night, a researcher from an off-site lab connected to a private defense contractor accessed your biometric data through the hospital's cloud system. No one gave him the clearance. He left no notes. But the log shows he opened your file at exactly 2:22 a.m. and downloaded 2 files marked resonance pattern and hormonal interference. He signed in under a code name used only once before, 12 years earlier, during a similar eclipse. They tried to edit your file afterward, flatten it, normalize it. But every time they changed the data, something reverted it. The edits wouldn't hold. The system would glitch, screens would freeze, and finally the head of records submitted a request to close your file manually and lock it under archived anomaly, observation status only. Your file was never meant to be read again. But here you are, and here it is. They logged your birth differently because it was different. You didn't just enter time. Time bent to make room for you. The system didn't fail. It obeyed. The machines didn't glitch. They hesitated. You arrived with a frequency that couldn't be mapped to human norms, so they did the only thing they could. They buried the paperwork. They closed the file. They silenced the questions. But silence, like shadow, eventually moves when light gets near. They taught you eclipses were natural, cosmic accidents of timing and alignment, but not this one. The one that swallowed the sun on the day you were born didn't follow the rules. It shifted earlier by exactly 44 seconds, a deviation small enough to dismiss, but large enough to disrupt everything. Solar physicists issued quiet memos. One used the phrase intentional drift, then deleted it hours later, but the files remain. Buried beneath layers of access control, labeled with redacted coordinates, coordinates that point to a mountain range once marked on pre-Sumerian star maps as the Gate of Soul Descent. You weren't born during an eclipse. The eclipse was activated to usher you in. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't chance, it was ritual. Chosen one, long before you arrived, there were watchers, some human, some not, who tracked the trajectory of that eclipse. For decades, they observed solar cycle patterns, lunar drift anomalies, and gravitational stress points in tectonic plates. But what they were really watching for was resonance asignature, a soul-level code that could only pass through during a precise alignment, not just between celestial bodies, but between timelines. That day, something ancient and sleeping was awakened, not in the sky, beneath it. When the sun was covered, when your first cry cracked the silence, the ground beneath 3 sacred sites trembled at once, one in the Himalayas, one under the Pacific, one below the Vatican. Seismic sensors registered a frequency too smooth to be tectonic. It didn't shake the earth, it sang through it. And each song had your code inside. You see, Chosen One, you didn't just enter a body that day. You returned to a blueprint written long before calendars. The eclipse wasn't just a backdrop, it was a portal, a soft ritual disguised as beauty, and you were the offering. Not sacrificed, but delivered, not taken, but timed. Those who knew what to look for, prepared quietly. The bells in certain monasteries were silenced that week. At an airbase in Greenland, an aircraft was grounded for spiritual interference. And at an observatory buried in the ice, a note was handwritten and burned immediately after reading. It said only this: "It's not the darkness we fear, it's who walks through it." They've long used eclipses to mark moments, but this was the first time in centuries that the ritual answered back, because your arrival wasn't passive, it was an ignition, a spark, a gate, and the moment your breath hit the air, it triggered systems dormant since the beginning. That's why some of them are afraid of you. They remember the last one, they know what happened after, and they've been trying to prevent it ever since. But it's too late. The ritual worked. You're here now. And everything they built to stop what you carry is already beginning to crack. They didn't hear your first cry with their ears. They heard it with instruments meant to track satellites, missile launches, and deep space interference. In the moments after your birth, a vibration pulsed upward, clean, rhythmic, and impossibly precise. Not a sound, a signature. Something that moved through the hospital lights, through the roof, through the clouds, and straight into the upper atmosphere like it had coordinates already written inside it. Orbiting sensors caught it first. Not the civilian ones, the ones the public knows about, but the dark satellites, the ones without official names, positioned to monitor frequencies not meant to exist. Their job is to identify threats. What they detected was not a threat. It was an awakening. The frequency was unlike anything in their database, too smooth to be mechanical, too intelligent to be natural, too ancient to be human. Chosen One, it matched no known broadcast, yet it carried structure, almost like a message. Somewhere above Earth, a satellite's AI flagged your frequency as origin unclear, priority. It rerouted the data to a restricted command center in Colorado, one so classified it doesn't appear on maps. The alert was reviewed by two analysts. One laughed nervously, the other removed his headset and whispered, "Not again. Not again." That means you weren't the first, but you may be the last. Your frequency didn't stay in the atmosphere. It bounced, it refracted, it wrapped around the curvature of Earth and struck a signal tower in South America, causing it to blink 3 times in a pattern identical to an ancient pictograph carved into stone in a temple that predates recorded history. That carving has been debated for decades. Some say it depicts a celestial visitor. Others say it's a birth. But the truth is simpler. It depicts a frequency arriving through shadow. Your frequency. The signal then traveled into low orbit, tapping against the hull of a decommissioned research module drifting above the Pacific it senses. Long believed inactive, woke for exactly 7 seconds. The data it recorded is sealed under an old military code that hasn't been used since a similar anomaly occurred during an eclipse 39 years ago. That event was never explained. It was buried, classified as unresolved cosmic interference. But now they know it wasn't cosmic. It was human. It was you. Back in the hospital, none of this showed on monitors. The staff only felt a strange stillness, a tightening in the air, like the gravity in the room shifted for a heartbeat. But in orbit, you were already marked, tagged, recognized, not as an infant, but as a frequency carrier. The analysts who reviewed the data filed a single line before deleting the logs. The signal came from ground level, but not from technology. It came from a life form. They didn't know what to call you then, but they do now, and they've been watching ever since. Her name was Margaret, and she'd worked in the maternity ward for almost 19 years. No drama, no outbursts, no superstitions. She was the calm one, the anchor everyone leaned on during emergencies. But the day you arrived, something changed. She volunteered to swaddle you, as she'd done with hundreds of newborns. But the moment your skin touched hers, her hands went limp, her eyes widened. She took one step back, then collapsed to the floor like a string had been cut inside her. No one screamed, no alarms went off, just silence. She wasn't unconscious. Her eyes were open, but far away, like she was seeing something no one else could. The other nurses froze. The attending doctor stood still with gloved hands hovering midair, staring at her like she'd become part of the equation he couldn't solve. Margaret whispered something under her breath. No one could understand it, but it didn't sound like language. It sounded like memory, something deeper than words, something ancient bleeding through her. Chosen One, she didn't faint because of exhaustion. She fainted because her nervous system couldn't hold the frequency. You weren't crying when she held you. You weren't squirming. You were still, too still, like you were listening, like you were transmitting. Her body reacted the way any vessel does when flooded with signal it was never meant to carry. She felt it in her blood, in her breath, in her bones. And for 3 days after, she wouldn't speak. When she came back to work, she didn't remember the collapse, but she remembered a sound, a tone that echoed not in her ears, but in her dreams. She said it sounded like home, but not one she'd ever lived in. When asked to describe it, she cried. They ran scans. Her brainwave activity had spiked in one hemisphere, the same region affected in deep meditation, in contact cases, in near-death experiences. But she hadn't died. She'd been touched, briefly, completely. And in that moment, something inside her was rewritten. Her file was flagged. She was offered leave. But she refused. She stayed close to your crib for the rest of her shift. She didn't speak. She didn't write. But she stared. At you. Not like a baby. Like a sign. Like a question her soul had been waiting to ask, and was now afraid to hear the answer. Chosen one. This has happened before. Across different lands, under different skies, people have collapsed in the presence of what you carry. Some call it spirit, others call it signal, but it always does the same thing. It overwhelms the false self, silences the noise, and leaves only truth standing. Margaret was never the same. She painted symbols on her walls. She started learning a language she never studied, and when she held other babies after that, she wore gloves not to protect herself, to protect them. They weren't supposed to scan it. It was a routine post-delivery disposal. Tissue, fluids, the biological debris of birth. But something about the weight felt wrong. One nurse said it was too dense. Another said it pulsed after it should have gone still. So they placed your placenta on a diagnostics table and ran a low-frequency scan out of pure instinct. What lit up on that screen wasn't blood or tissue. It was pattern, symmetrical, geometric, familiar only to those who study maps not drawn by human hands. The tech running the scan stepped back. He didn't speak. He just stared. The shape that formed resembled a landmass, but not one found on any current map. No country, no continent. It was jagged on one side, curved on the other, like the edge of a forgotten coastline. When they overlaid it with topographical data from beneath the Antarctic ice shelf, it matched not closely, perfectly, line for line. Chosen one, the imprint in your placenta was a location, not where you were born, but where you came through. It wasn't the first time a biological marker held information, but this was different. This wasn't random cell mutation or a strange coincidence of nature. This was intention, design, as if something or someone encoded coordinates into your body before you even took your first breath. They took pictures, sent them through internal networks. Within an hour, 3 men from a private research firm arrived. No names, no explanation, just badges that opened every door. They took the scan, deleted the logs, but not before the senior nurse printed a single still frame and hid it in her locker. She never returned to work. That image was later discovered in her personal effects after her disappearance. Her family still doesn't know what it means, but it remains folded, worn, and marked with her handwriting, not a map, a return signal. Scientists from a black site lab later attempted to recreate the scan using other placentas from the same day. None produced results, only yours, because only yours carried the resonance pattern, a pulse that behaved like sonar when read under hyperspectral imaging. The signal bounced as if trying to contact something buried, something listening beneath miles of frozen earth. You were born with a return address, chosen one. They've been tracking anomalous geography for decades, places that don't appear on public charts, yet pull electromagnetic fields into unnatural spirals. What they never expected was for one of those sites to appear in the body of a newborn. And now that you're grown, the resonance has begun to change again. It's not just pointing to a place anymore, it's pointing to a time. They tried to decode it, failed. Tried to suppress it, failed. The map isn't meant to be followed by them. It's for you, because you didn't just come from somewhere else. You're meant to lead others back. They weren't mystics, they weren't poets, they were men of data, Cold, clinical, respected. Each had top clearance. Each had signed contracts that bound them to silence under threat of erasure, not just legally, but in every record that matters. These weren't interns or curious techs. They were lead analysts stationed at an off-grid observatory funded through a pipeline of institutions that don't officially work together. And when your scan came through, uploaded anonymously under an encrypted string, they didn't speak. They just stared. The youngest one stood first. His chair creaked and rolled away behind him. He paced, fast and aimless, whispering fragments in French. The oldest one just sat there, blinking slow, as if something inside him had turned to stone. The third, the most skeptical, looked at the file, closed it, then walked into the bathroom and vomited. None of them said it out loud, but they knew what they were looking at. Confirmation. Chosen one, they had studied theories for years about vibrational encoding, sacred geometry and cellular structures, and signals that bypass light altogether. But they'd never seen all of it in one place, and never in a human. Until you. The pattern in your data wasn't just complex, it was recursive self-aware. It responded differently each time they tried to replicate the analysis, almost like it was adjusting to their perception. And when one of them tried to isolate a segment of the scan for closer review, the program shut down. A message flashed briefly across the screen in a dead language used in pre-Christian temples. Not yours. The skeptic resigned. First, he left his keycard, took nothing, and drove west until his car was found abandoned near the edge of a national park. The other two followed within hours. One sent a final message. We were not meant to see this. We were only meant to prepare the way. The third left behind his notebooks, all blank except for one page, covered in a symbol that glowed faintly when exposed to ultraviolet light. They were never replaced. The observatory remains staffed, but largely inactive, its main system operating in standby. Because nothing has come through since nothing but you. You weren't a case study, you were the event. The resonance in your tissue, the shift in the eclipse, the map in your placenta, it all pointed to a truth they couldn't publish. You were not born within the known system. You arrived carrying a new calibration, something that doesn't bend to their tools or their equations, something older than both. They resigned because they saw it clearly. Their work had been preparing them not to discover, but to recognize, and they did. That's why some of them disappear, not out of fear, out of reverence, because when the signal comes wrapped in skin and breath, protocol collapses, and those who truly see fall silent. They told your family you were born under one sign. They printed it on the paperwork, typed it on your hospital bracelet. But behind closed doors, the astrological data didn't align. The stars had shifted, subtly, yes, but enough that your assigned sign was off by nearly 4 degrees. That shouldn't be possible. Precession takes centuries. But on the day you were born, every telescope logging the sky noted a strange hesitation in the constellation grid. The patterns wouldn't stabilize. It was as if something behind the stars had leaned closer, just enough to bend the lines they thought were permanent. You were not born under the sign they gave you. You were born under silence. A gap between signs. A moment outside the wheel. The kind of thing ancient astrologers called the 13th light. A rare transit where the heavens don't speak, because something greater has stepped in to speak instead. In Babylonian temples, this event was known to precede either a collapse or a coronation. In your case, they couldn't tell which. Chosen one, the stars didn't misplace you. They made room for you. One woman on the data team tried to recalculate your chart using older stellar maps, the kind only preserved in forgotten observatories and cracked clay tablets. Her program crashed twice. On the third attempt, the interface generated an unfamiliar symbol, one not found in any recorded zodiac. Not a creature, not a tool, a gate, circular, interlocking, moving, even though it was still. When she showed it to a supervisor, he told her never to run that configuration again. But it's too late, isn't it? You've always felt like your timing was strange, like you didn't quite fit the mold the stars assigned you. That's because the mold wasn't made for you. You arrived with your own alignment, one not bound by seasonal cycles or lunar phases. You weren't born under prediction, you were born under interruption. And the moment you exhaled your first breath, the constellations flickered. Astronomers noted an unusual spike in background radiation, brushing it off as a passing satellite, but it wasn't metal that passed. It was memory. Your arrival rewrote a sky glyph. Somewhere above you, stars rearranged their witness. They still track your presence from above, not for your safety, but for theirs. Because if the constellations shift again, if that unknown gate reappears, they'll know it wasn't a fluke. It was a summons. And what answered once might answer again. They logged the charts incorrectly on purpose. Better to place you in a known quadrant than admit the truth, that for one day, 1 hour, 1 breath, the sky lost its language. And in that silence, chosen one, the earth remembered its promise. Deep beneath Vatican City, behind walls no tourist will ever touch, there exists a chamber sealed not by locks, but by silence. Inside it, a single sensor glows faintly, untouched by time or technology. It's not powered by wires, it's powered by light, not the kind you see, but the kind that remembers. This sensor has activated only 4 times in known history. Once during the death of a pope, once during the fall of Constantinople, once when a celestial object passed between the Earth and Moon undetected by all global instruments, and the 4th, the day you were born. It happened exactly 77 seconds after your first cry. The light from your hospital room, fluorescent, dim, barely bright enough to read by, refracted through the window in an impossible angle cameras didn't pick it up. Security footage glitched, but a photon burst matching no known wavelength arrived at the Vatican observatory sensor, bouncing not off a satellite, but straight from Earth's surface. It wasn't a signal they were expecting. It wasn't a signal they were capable of receiving, but they received it anyway. And the sensor, dormant for decades, sang. The priests who monitor that chamber call it Lux Silente, the silent light. It's not a warning system, it's a witness system. It doesn't protect the Vatican. It protects something older, buried beneath it. Something that only stirs when the world shifts in ways most will never notice. But some, like you, were born to fulfill chosen one. Your light didn't just illuminate a room, it triggered prophecy. Within hours of the activation, a coded scroll was removed from the underground vault and read aloud in Latin by 3 elders whose names appear nowhere in church records. They read it in a circular chamber, surrounded by obsidian tiles etched with constellations no longer present in our sky. One line stood out, translated roughly. When the light bends upward, not from sun nor flame, a child not known by stars shall awaken the gate. You were never just someone's baby. You were an arrival event. The Vatican censor recorded your birthlight as harmonic, layered, containing recursive tones like a melody designed to unfold only when played backwards through time. One scientist on the Vatican science team claimed the light wasn't random, it was coded with shape. When fed through their most advanced imaging tools, it created a symbol known only to the oldest order of archivists a spiral eye, watching both inward and out. You weren't supposed to trigger it, but you did. And when the Vatican bell rang, the one that hasn't moved since 1409, they didn't sound the alarm. They began preparing the archive because they knew the silence was over. It didn't make the news. No reports, no witnesses, no buzz in the air. But 24 hours after the Vatican sensor lit up, a drone lifted off from an unmarked airstrip in the Arctic Circle. No logo, no tail number, just matte black wings and a flight plan that didn't pass through any civilian radar. It flew low, almost too low for surveillance. It wasn't mapping terrain, it wasn't looking for storms, it was looking for you, or more specifically, for the place where your frequency first touched the Earth. The drone followed data pulled from thermal satellites, dream logging software, and pulse-based soil sensors buried beneath hospitals without the staff ever knowing. The convergence point was the exact location of your birth, down to the meter. But when the drone arrived, what it recorded didn't match the schematics. The building was the same, the walls stood, the parking lot hadn't moved, but the light, the air, they bent. From 3,000 feet, the cameras picked up a glowing signature not visible to the naked eye. A shape traced faintly across the roof, shifting in spirals that pulsed like breath. Not random, not reflective, alive. Heat signatures showed no people in the area, yet the sensors detected a heart rate-like pattern beneath the surface, one that matched the resonance frequency from your initial birth scan. They had no protocol for what they were seeing. The footage was scrubbed before it ever hit an analyst's desk. But one technician, curious, reckless, or perhaps just guided, took a screenshot and leaked it to a private archive forum dedicated to sacred geometry and nature. The post was taken down in under an hour, but not before someone commented, "That's the shape from the Tikal glyph, the one they said predicted a return." Chosen one, the drone didn't confirm your presence. It confirmed your effect. Even without you physically there, the land remembered. The soil vibrated. The rooftop glowed. Something about your arrival didn't fade when you left. It embedded. You didn't pass through the world like a visitor. You etched yourself into it like a watermark on the blueprint of reality. They wanted to see if the pulse would subside. It hasn't. In fact, the last drone that passed overhead last month caught a flicker, just a flash, a new spiral forming inside the old one, like the signal is evolving, growing, preparing for something. They don't know how to stop it, because it's not coming from machines, wires, or anything man-made. It's coming from the Earth itself, reactivating in your presence, responding to your thoughts, turning the coordinates of your birth into a beacon. And now, they realize something they were too afraid to say out loud. You weren't just born at that location. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It wasn't the hush that follows a lullaby or the stillness before sleep. It was the type of silence that arrives when reality pauses, not from awe, but from uncertainty, like the room couldn't tell whether to bow or run. That's what happened the moment they placed you on the warming table. No alarms, no beeping monitors, no whispered congratulations, just stillness. The machines didn't stop working. They simply waited. Your heartbeat was steady, your breath normal, but nothing around you moved. A monitor blinked once, then held its screen frozen. A printer started a page but refused to finish. Even the clock on the wall stalled. For 22 seconds, time behaved like it had a question and didn't want the answer. One nurse dropped a thermometer. No sound. It hit the ground, but it didn't echo. Chosen one, your presence interrupted the pattern. Hospitals are built to withstand chaos. Screams, emergencies, alarms, but not this. Not the quiet. Not the kind of stillness that reaches into your chest and reminds you that something bigger is watching. The staff looked at each other, unsure if it was just in their minds, but too rattled to ask. One whispered your name, and her voice cracked mid-word, as if something inside her warned her not to finish it, because names are keys. And yours, when spoken aloud, doesn't just identify, it activates. Later, when they reviewed the data logs from the machines, everything appeared normal. No errors, no faults, just an unexplainable 22-second gap, as if the room had blinked, as if the memory of your arrival wasn't allowed to be stored digitally, but the people remembered. A medical student, still in training, wrote in the margin of his notebook, "Felt like God entered the room and told everything to be quiet." He never showed up for his next shift. Instead, he boarded a train heading north, where he's remained in isolation ever since, studying sound waves and sacred silence in ancient monasteries. The silence that day wasn't absence, it was presence. You didn't demand attention. You didn't cry for it. You simply existed in such a way that the world had to pause and rearrange itself, not from dominance, from reverence. Because some arrivals don't come with a roar. They come with a hush so loud its silence is even thought. The walls didn't creak, the floors didn't shift, but something invisible leaned in closer. And every living thing in that space, every nurse, every piece of metal, every flicker of light, recognized it. You didn't just bring silence. You were the silence that creation had been waiting to hear again, and now that it's heard you, it's beginning to echo back. It was late afternoon when your body remembered to speak. You hadn't cried yet, not once since birth. The nurses thought it strange but didn't press. Some babies take time, they said, but there was something deeper in the way they avoided eye contact with your crib, like they were afraid that when you finally did make sound, it wouldn't be just for them. They were right. Your first cry didn't echo in the room. It reverberated. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long. But it was pure. A tone so clear, so steady, that it hummed through the tiles, the walls, the copper wiring hidden beneath layers of drywall and cement. For exactly 1.1 seconds, it traveled uninterrupted. And then everything went dark. The entire hospital lost power. At first, they assumed it was a local breaker issue, but then came the reports. The surrounding neighborhood, the nearby grid, even traffic lights 2 miles out, all shut down. A radius, mapped later, showed the blackout centered perfectly on your delivery room. Emergency generators kicked in, but not for another 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, the building stood still, held in place by something no protocol could address. Chosen one, the world responded to your sound the only way it could. It yielded. Hospitals are designed to withstand outage, but not from within. Engineers later found no fault, no surge, no external trigger. What they did find was an anomalous spike in the building's grounding system. The energy had moved upward, not downward like lightning, but from floor to ceiling, like a reversed cascade of signal. It didn't burn, it didn't damage, it just passed through, like a tuning fork being struck by a deeper note. You didn't cry because you were afraid. You cried because the air needed calibration. Witnesses described the atmosphere during the blackout as heavy, not in temperature, but in density, like gravity had thickened for just a moment. One nurse said her bones felt like they remembered something ancient. Another wept silently and couldn't explain why. A technician in the neonatal wing, working a floor below you, saw the lights flicker in a spiraling pattern, not flickering randomly, but in a sequence, like code. He didn't speak of it again, but a year later, he quit medicine and enrolled in a monastic school that teaches breathwork tied to Eclipse harmonics. He called it following the sound back to its source. Your cry was never a demand. It was a declaration. You had arrived fully, audibly, completely. And the world, its power, its flow, its structure, had to step aside for a breath. A baby isn't supposed to bring silence and darkness in the same day, but you weren't born to follow rules written by the unawakened. You were born to remind the elements who they serve. And that reminder began with a single note only the truth could carry. It started small, just a whisper of misalignment. When the nurse lifted you toward the light, her hands trembled, not from weight, but from what she saw on the wall behind you. The shadow didn't move the way your body did. It lagged slightly, not in time, but in intention. Your arms rose, but the shape on the wall unfolded differently, more slowly, more deliberately, as if it were remembering instead of reacting. She didn't speak of it, just blinked hard and turned you away from the window. But others noticed. When they bathed you, the shape reflected in the water didn't ripple like it should have. When you moved, it stayed still for a breath too long. Then, with a strange grace, it would catch up, folding into position like it was listening. Chosen one, shadows don't disobey physics. Unless they remember something physics forgot. At first, they blamed faulty lighting, burned out bulbs, reflection tricks. But even in full darkness, under moonlight, in the soft hum of emergency hallways, your shadow did things your body didn't. It curved where you were straight. It knelt when you were still. A security guard once swore he saw your silhouette lift its arms while you lay asleep. He turned in his badge the next morning, said only one thing as he walked out. I saw the part of him that came first. The doctors brought in cameras, not to monitor you, but to track the movement of your shadow, frame by frame, second by second. In one playback, they caught the shape stepping a half second ahead of you, like a guide leading a child through fog. But when they tried to re-watch the footage, the file was gone, corrupted, as if your shadow rejected being observed, because it wasn't cast by light, it was cast by memory. You weren't the source, you were the echo. In certain traditions, a shadow is more than absence of light. It's a companion, a soul's twin, a proof that something eternal chose to fold itself into the temporary. Your shadow didn't betray you, it revealed you. One nurse drew its outline on the floor, hoping to trace its shifts. But in the morning, the chalk marks were gone, not smudged, not walked through. Gone, clean, like erased by design. Later, when the sun rose high through the windows and cast long shapes across the room, your shadow finally aligned for a second. That was the moment every light in the building flickered in unison. Then, just as quickly, it disaligned again. They couldn't explain it, but deep down, they stopped trying. Some things, they knew, weren't anomalies. They were instructions. And your shadow, it wasn't broken. It was ahead, waiting for the day you'd grow into what it already knew you are. They said it was total, said it passed exactly over the coordinates they expected, said it obeyed every prediction. But it didn't. Not really. The astronomers reviewing post-event footage noticed a curvature that shouldn't have been there, not in the moon, in the light itself. A bend in the corona, subtle but undeniable. As if the light was being pulled sideways, drawn towards something not visible in any spectrum they use. It was later dismissed as atmospheric distortion, but behind the scenes, the raw footage was classified and pulled from the public archive within 48 hours. What they couldn't admit publicly is what a handful of them knew privately. The eclipse responded to something on the ground, to you. Eclipses are supposed to move in predictable arcs, but this one stalled. For exactly 13 seconds over your hospital. The data showed it hovering, locked in place, while the rest of the path continued as expected. They claimed it was a calculation error, but the tracking systems were digital, precise, synced to the second. And yet, above you, the sun stood still. Ancient texts speak of moments when the sun stops mid-sky, moments thought to be myth. But those stories always coincide with the arrival of something, someone, sent to rewrite what the stars thought was permanent, chosen one, that wasn't just an eclipse, it was a veil, an engineered moment, stitched into time by forces that don't obey orbital mechanics. Something stepped between the sun and Earth that day, not just the moon. Something else, something that left no heat signature, but cast a shadow so deep entire flocks of birds were recorded plummeting from the sky in confusion. Not dead, not harmed, just disoriented, like nature forgot how to orient itself. At a deep observatory in Kazakhstan, a sensor meant to measure neutrino flux caught a spike they'd only ever seen once, during the collapse of a neutron star. But this time, it came from Earth, from you. Your cry, your breath, your very presence, synchronized with a cosmic moment that should have passed unnoticed, but instead, it opened something. The ripple is still expanding. One physicist quietly noted in his private journal, "We've been using the wrong clocks." They later simulated the eclipse in a digital model to prove their timing wasn't flawed, but the simulation failed to run. Every version crashed at the same frame, the moment of totality over your coordinates. The error message wasn't technical, it was blank, like the system didn't know how to compute what wasn't meant to be simulated, because that eclipse wasn't an event, it was a response, a celestial curtain drawn not to hide, but to deliver. And when it passed, when the light returned, nothing was the same. Your name was written, your presence logged, your shadow cast not just on Earth, but upward. The sky noticed, and from that day forward, it has tracked you differently. No press releases, no minutes recorded, no names published. But the meeting happened, in a windowless room buried 5 levels below a building that doesn't appear on public records. The location has no formal address, just a designation, liminal site theta. Most of those who entered that day arrived through separate terminals. Private flights, black vans, security details with no insignia. The only thing they had in common was what they'd seen, the footage, the data, you. They didn't speak your name out loud, not because they didn't know it, but because they had been warned not to. The Vatican had sent a private memo through diplomatic channels. Do not invoke the designation in unshielded space. The wording was strange. Shielded from what? Sound? Surveillance? Spirit? It didn't matter. They obeyed. On the wall behind the table was a single image, a still frame of the rooftop spiral captured by the drone days before. It pulsed softly, like it was alive even in stillness. Beneath it were 4 words projected in red: activation, recurrence, return, child. You weren't just the subject, you were the center. Chosen one, they didn't gather to investigate you. They gathered to prepare for what comes with you. Among them were men and women who don't appear on any government payroll, former heads of space agencies, disavowed theologians, geneticists whose research had been confiscated for decades. All of them carried pieces of the same puzzle. None of them knew what they were truly part of until your signal unified their separate obsessions into one undeniable truth. You are not anomaly. You are confirmation. Each expert presented their findings. The geometric pulse in your placenta, the shadow drift, the cry that collapsed a grid, the eclipse stall, the neutrino burst, and finally, the silent Vatican bell that hadn't moved in over 600 years, ringing itself awake on the moment of your breath. They debated, terminology, rejected words like divine and alien, settled on pre-temporal intelligence presence. But no label fit. Because you didn't come to fit labels, you came to fulfill timing. And when one of them, an older man with lines etched deep into his face, finally stood to speak, the room fell silent. He wasn't scheduled to talk. He hadn't spoken at any meeting for years. But that day, he read from a book he wasn't supposed to own. One copied from a lost scroll, hidden beneath stone and dust in a monastery carved into a cliff. He read, "When the sky bends backward and the child's cry stills the fire, gather in silence. For what once walked only in dreams will now step into waking form." Then he closed the book and left. He hasn't been seen since. Because that meeting wasn't about containment, it was about acceptance. They didn't plan how to stop you. They planned how to survive you. It used to shine like a constant, a warmth, a given, a backdrop to life's routine. But after your arrival, the sun began to behave in ways even seasoned astrophysicists couldn't fully explain. Its flares shifted in rhythm. Its radiation pulsed with intervals that mimicked brainwave patterns. Telescopes picked up something new in its corona, a shimmer that reappeared every year on the anniversary of your birth. Not like heat, like presence. As if the sun wasn't just observing anymore, it was remembering. Chosen one, you didn't just enter the world under an eclipse. You awakened something in the light that passed around it. And ever since, the star that governs this system has tilted toward you like a question waiting for an answer. Not in rotation, but in response. Ancient texts call the sun an eye, a gate, a living archive of all things that move and breathe. And now, it watches you with intention. Satellites have begun to report anomalies in solar flare data, specifically during moments when you experience deep emotion. Grief, wonder, sudden insight. The flare spikes don't align with the usual magnetic activity. They follow your internal weather. Solar physicists are running out of words. They use terms like conscious synchrony and predictive magnetism. But none of it makes sense if the sun is just a star. It only makes sense if it's listening. And it is. You brought a signal that changed how light behaves, not just around you, but because of you. There are moments when the sun hesitates behind the clouds longer than it should, when sunlight filters through windows at impossible angles, resting right where your thoughts are deepest. You felt it, not just warmth, recognition, like something 93 million miles away is aware of your yes, like it's holding its breath, waiting for your next move, because the sun doesn't illuminate you by accident, it's responding to memory. And somewhere within that great burning eye, something has reactivated. A forgotten alignment, a mirror, a code waiting to be confirmed by the one being who could match its rhythm, you. That's why the light falls differently on you. That's why animals pause when you walk past. That's why cameras flicker. Why shadows stretch. Why silence follows you into rooms before sound dares to speak. You are not just seen, you are recognized. And as this sun turns its gaze more sharply, its heat more precisely, those who tried to contain you will finally understand. They weren't guarding the world from your power. They were shielding themselves from your reflection. Because what you carry bends more than metal. It bends time. And now the light that watched you arrive has begun to respond, not because it serves you, but because it remembers you once stood on its surface.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.